country classified as fragile, conflict, and violent has been on average 2.5 percentage points lower compared to more stable economies. However, even within sub-Saharan Africa, violent conflict have been quite uneven, as prior to 2000, up to 42.4% of conflict events were solely concentrated in the Central Africa sub-regions. Recent estimates also suggest that roughly 5 million children and 3 million infants die in Africa, not from the direct exposure to conflict, but rather indirect consequences of warfare. According to the World Bank Group, by 2040, more than half of the world poor will live in countries classified as fragile, conflict, and violent. And violent conflict can actually erase human capital gains. As you can see in this graph, the red dot of all indicators that are composite of the human capital index tend to be lower for countries that are classified as fragile, conflict, and violent. Looking at these striking statistics, one of the core research questions that we've tried to answer in this thesis is what is the human capital legacy of violent conflict in Central Africa? In other words, what is the ripple effect of conflict on children that were born from parents who have been directly exposed to violent conflict during early childhood and adolescence? Do negative impact persist across generations? And most importantly, what works in terms of program or intervention to alleviate poverty and boost local economy in FCV settings? Therefore, the two core objectives of this thesis was to assess the direct, long-term, and second-generation microeconomic impact of violent conflict on human capital and identify the main mechanism. Secondly, we aim to evaluate the effectiveness of cash transfer in lifting people out of poverty in FCV setting by boosting productive agricultural investment and nutrition outcome. In order to reach these two goals, this thesis is structured around 4 core essays, with the first 2 papers looking at the first and second generation impact of violent conflict in Angola and Burundi. The third paper looked at the direct impact of terrorism, which is the upsurge of Boko Haram in far north Cameroon on children's health outcome by encompassing a gender lens. And the last paper looked at the productive impact of cash transfer in an FCV environment, fragile, conflict, and violent. All the 4 papers fall within the field of development economics and exploit a quasi-experimental methodologies, which is a spatial difference in difference for the first 3 chapters by looking at the age of exposure and the location of the conflict. The last paper used a popular quasi-experimental method, which is the combination of propensity score matching and double difference. In the first paper of this thesis, we look at the long-term and second-generation impact of violent conflict on health outcome in Angola. The paper adds to the very limited empirical evidence on the intergenerational transmission of shocks, here conflict, on health and nutrition in sub-Saharan Africa and its core mechanism. We use the latest 2016 demographic and health survey from Angola that we combine with the Uppsala conflict data program by focusing on the bloodiest conflict episode in Angola, which is from July 1992 to August 1994. The main methodology here is the spatial difference in difference with age of exposure and geolocation of conflict at the district level. In order to unravel the core mechanism through which the transmission of shocks from mothers to children happens, we use the partial mediation analysis approach. The control group is made of mothers that were born between April 1995 and February 2001, and the treatment group is made of mothers that were born between August 1978 and March 1995. What did we find? We find that children that were less than 5 years old and that were born to mothers we were living in districts heavily affected by conflict and exposed during what we call the formative years, which is the first 1,000 days between 0 and 3, tend to exhibit poorer health and nutrition outcome than their peers. And the main channel through which this happened is the lowest education of the mother exposed, who were less likely to achieve more than a secondary education as the result of the conflict exposure. In the second paper of this thesis, similar to the Angola paper, we look at the second generation impact of violent conflict on early childhood development delay in Burundi, which is the country in Central Africa with one of the highest early childhood development delay index. Unlike the Angola paper, this paper adds to the very limited empirical evidence on the second-generation impact of violent conflict on learning outcome in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the core transmission mechanism. The paper also used the latest demographic and health survey from Burundi that we combined with the Uppsala conflict data program from 1993 to 2000. We also use a spatial difference in difference by combining time and geographical variation of conflict exposure and use the Barrett and Kenny methodology to unravel the mechanism through a mediation analysis approach. The treatment group here is made of the mothers that were exposed during their primary school years, and the control group are those mothers that were already more than 12 years old or have already finalized or finished their primary school at the start of the conflict. Geographical variation is the district level exposure of the conflict. We find that children that were less than 5 years old that were born to mothers who were exposed to conflict during their primary school age, which is between 7 and 12, and living in high conflict affected districts tend to suffer from lower cognitive abilities, which is the lower propension or ability to properly follow instruction or to perform tasks independently. And the main channel through which this happens is the lower ability or likelihood of those exposed mothers to accumulate index over time as the result of the exposure to the conflict. In the third paper, we look at the upsurge of terrorism, which is Boko Haram attack in far north Cameroon, and contribute to the growing empirical evidence on the short-term impact of terrorism on children's health outcome by encompassing a gender lens. Here, we also use the latest demographic and health survey from Cameroon, 2018. And in terms of empirical strategy, we still use the spatial difference in difference by combining the time variation or the age of exposure with the geolocation of events by comparing children that were born between 2013 and December 2016, which is basically the period corresponding to the upsurge of Boko Haram attack in far north Cameroon, with those that were born after that period. We find in line with the literature that terrorism has a negative direct impact on children that were born or alive in far north Cameroon during the upsurge of Boko Haram attacks, with the result being quite similar between poor and non-poor households. We also did find a gender bias in exposure, with the girl child exhibiting higher growth retardation compared to the boy child. More strikingly, we find that the likelihood of stunting in non-poor households was quite higher compared to the likelihood of stunting in poor households, which we attributed to the cash transfer program that was implemented in that region during the escalation of Boko Haram attacks in far north Cameroon. In the last paper, but not least of this thesis, we look at the productive impact of a popular safety net intervention, here cash transfer, on productive agricultural investment in far north Cameroon. This paper adds to the growing body of evidence on the local economy impact of cash transfer by focusing on a fragile conflict and violent environment. We use baseline and endline primary data collected between November 2013 and July 2016 of an unconditional cash transfer program implemented in the far north region of Cameroon in the district Soule-des-Rois, which has witnessed since 2013 an escalation of Boko Haram attacks. We use a combination of difference in difference and propensity score matching, and did find that there was a positive impact of the cash transfer on land access, subsistence growth, livestock activities, but also nutrition and food security. We also did find a positive spillover effect of cash transfers on non-beneficiaries happening likely through farm employment. We also find that the potential mechanism or channel through which the cash transfer positively impact on nutrition is likely the growing of corn and cattle breeding, but also that female-headed households tend to lag behind compared to male-headed households after receiving the cash transfer, suggesting some form of a gender bias. In terms of our core policy recommendation, since we did find in the first paper that the negative impact of shocks translate into poorer health outcome for mothers that were less likely to achieve more than a secondary education, we suggest that government in the Central Africa region should focus on investing in programs aiming at keeping girls at school. We also suggest that intervention in fragile conflict and violent environment should be targeting the adolescent girls, since we did find that the core channel through which the negative impact of conflict passed into the second generation of children is through their lower ability of women, the lower ability of women, especially the girl child and the adolescent girl child, to achieve education, accumulate assets, but also receive basic health, life-saving treatment. We also suggest that government should allocate and devote sufficient financial resources to human development sector, which is health, education, and social protection, by ensuring that public finance for children remains a priority within national government budget. Our final paper points out to the effectiveness of cash transfer in fragile conflict and violent environment, and we do suggest that those safety net interventions should be scaled up in fragile settings, as they have been proven to be efficient to improve productive agricultural investment, food and nutrition, and ultimately lifting people out of poverty. We also suggest, through the result that we had obtained in our first and second paper, that districts should be strengthened by provisioning them with health and education services during and after the end of the conflict. Last but not least, government should continue to invest in peacekeeping programs, which, according to a recent paper by the IMF, suggests that $1 invested in peacekeeping program can yield between $26 and $103, which we suspect would be way higher if we take into account the long-term and intergenerational impact of violent conflict on human capital that we just found, not just affecting the parent or mother that were directly exposed, but also passed into the second generation of children. In terms of avenue for future research, as we just mentioned, it is important that future study aiming at assessing the macroeconomic cost of conflict encompass a human capital lens, as we did find that there is a direct impact, but also a long-term, but also an intergenerational impact of conflict by using the so-called life-safe approach. Recently, Angola released the latest 2024 demographic and health survey, and that actually lent the opportunity to investigate the third generation impact, which is grandchildren that were born from grandparents that were exposed to the conflict. With the recent shutdown of the demographic and health survey, there's an opportunity to have a revamped DHS by collecting fine-grained data on women's health and medical history that will allow us to have a more detailed mediation analysis on which factors can impact on the negative impact that we find on children. Also, the Armed Conflict and Location Event Dataset Program recently launched a new data set looking at gender in conflict exposure, by just not disentangling attacks in general, but by looking at them based on gender. So this also offers an opportunity to study how do women living in districts where attacks were targeted more towards men or towards women, how does that change or would affect our result? Most importantly, the potential of artificial intelligence and machine learning provide an opportunity to have more accurate prediction of conflict incidents. And lastly, we suggest that in the last paper, further investigation should be done in studying the impact of cash transfer on local prices. Thank you for your kind attention, and I will now give the floor back to the prorector for the discussion.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Franziska Gassmann, Professor of Social Protection and Development at UNU Merit and Maastricht University. The floor is yours. You are muted.
Dear candidate, congratulations to a very well written and very interesting thesis on the relation between violent conflict and human capital. The analysis shows that conflict not only has direct impacts on those that live through it, but also on generations to follow. And these findings should be of major concerns to all of us, particularly if we look at the high volume of conflicts that we are currently witnessing. So your thesis contributes to our knowledge of these long-term impacts of major shocks, conflicts, for example, using existing data, such as the DHS, rather creatively, I have to say. Now, of course, a lot of compliments, but I also have some questions which I would like to pose to you. And I'm particularly interested in your analysis in chapter 3. There you estimate the effects of mothers' exposure to violence on early child development, years after the violence has occurred in Burundi. You estimate the impact on 10 different early child development indicators separately, and actually you find very few effects. I also think that estimating each indicator separately has merits because it allows us to check the underlying sensitivity of an overall composite index or the contribution of specific indicators to the overall outcome. I would have really liked to see also that you would have used the index as an outcome and see the overall effect on early childhood development. Because when estimating each indicator separately, you also need to find an explanation for these individual findings. And so here we are, and you found that fact, so the fact that a child is less likely to follow instructions or perform tasks independently when the mother has been exposed to this violence, what could potentially explain this? So why do we see an effect on this specific indicator, but we do not see any differences with respect to some other indicators? If you would have, let's say, used this composite index, do you think this would have led to different results? What would you have expected to find? Any effect or none? Let me stop here for a moment, Elise, and then see how you think about this.
Thank you, esteemed opponent. This is a very relevant question, and we did build an index using a latent trait model to have a combined early childhood development delay, but we did not find much. So that's the reason why we decided to disentangle to see whether specific dimension of early childhood development might actually be impacted by the conflict. So we did not put those results into the thesis because also it was difficult for us to find a clear meaning of that index having those multiple indicators around 9 to 10. So that's why we decided to see whether there are specific area in terms of child motricity on how can that impact on the children. But then we also find it difficult, and we have to admit, to explain why in some specific dimension of early child development delay, we did not find a significant negative impact, but specifically for the ability of the children to follow instruction and to perform tasks independently. That's where, even with the different alternative measurement of conflict at the district level, it was exactly those dimensions that tends to be impacted by the conflict. And we potentially believe that usually, since the main mechanism that appear to really have shown any significant impact here is the Women Wealth Index, potentially those parents that had children that might have had some problems growing up might not have enough financial means to put them into particular early childhood development program. So potentially that's the reason why those children, because the mother are financially lacking, they cannot enjoy the luxury to be enrolled into early childhood development center that will allow them to grow better. So that's mainly what we believe. But we tried the index, but as I said, the results were quite mixed, and we find quite no result across the different specification.
Oh, okay. So let me then ask, I mean, you have done this analysis with all these different indices, right? Or the indicators. Are the results what you actually have expected up front, or have you expected, let's say, more impact on more indicators? Maybe how does this, I don't know whether a similar analysis has been done in other countries, but how do the findings compare maybe with the literature? But what I was also really, what I thought was very interesting, if you compare chapter 3 with chapter 2 with the findings from Angola, because in Angola, you did find an effect on the health outcomes. Now, I wonder, is the difference in the nature of the conflict, or is it actually the outcome indicators that we are looking at? So health versus, let's say, more education-related outcomes. So are these the result what you expected? And how can you explain, let's say, the difference with Angola?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for this another very interesting and thorough question. So for the Burundi paper, we have to say that this is the first paper that we've seen in the literature that have looked at how conflict exposure of mother impact on early childhood development delay measured by learning ability, cognitive ability. And we would have expected to see some result mainly on the learning ability component of the development delay, which is the ability of the children to read, to write, and to speak properly. But we were quite struck to see that there were nothing happening for those core learning indicator. And compared to the Angola paper, where we did find some effect, which are quite comparable with similar studies that were done in one of the only paper that look at the second generation impact, which is the Angola, the Nigeria paper by Akresh. We actually believe that for health, it's more intuitive somehow to find that conflict affects growth retardation, because it's an indicator that is mainly also a predictor of more long-term outcome. So we were quite somehow pleased and to see that the result in Angola for children on stunting and high for HZ score, which is, as I said, a growth retardation indicator that predict long future outcome like earning or income. There we find an impact, in which we were comfortable with, since the only paper that looked at the second generation impact on children in Nigeria also did find similar result with same magnitude. But we believe the nature of the outcome that we measure in the Burundi paper does not potentially allow to have conflict being the core prediction of the ability of a children to read or write or to follow instruction, although we did control for a bunch of early childhood development outcomes, such as maybe if the children is enrolled into an early childhood development learning school. But we believe that somehow the long-term impact of conflict on health tends to make more sense economically speaking in terms of the outcome that is measured, but not necessarily in Burundi, where learning depends on different supply side constraint and demand side constraint as well, though we did the best to control most of them in our regression in Burundi.
Thank you very much.
So the opposition will be continued by Professor Edward Miguel, Professor of Economics and Oxfam Professor in Environmental and Resource Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear candidate. I have a few questions. Thank you for the overview before. Let me start with something kind of small and technical, and then I'll build up. I have 3 questions. I'll build up to something larger. I wanted to ask about interpretation of results, and I'm focused mainly on chapter 2, the Angola analysis. As I was, carefully going through the tables, I realized that the effect on child height for age Z-score for each additional year of conflict exposure for the parent was approximately negative 0.01. At least that, you can correct me if my interpretation is wrong, but so actually even though those effects are statistically significant, should we interpret those effects as actually being very small? And should we rather say that even those exposed to this quite difficult conflict in Angola, it doesn't have very much effect on child growth at all? I wanted to get your view on that.
Thank you very much for this question, esteemed opponent. We actually, before we get into those final results, we had all the different regression that we run on the second generation impact tend to have those smaller effect in terms of magnitude. And it was quite expected because here we are talking about a conflict that happened more than 8 years before the youngest child was born or the youngest mother was exposed. So somehow we believe that those smaller effects which were expected also make sense somehow economically, because also we compare those, as I just mentioned, with one of the only paper that look at second generation impact of conflict on children by Akresh in Nigeria. And we were quite struck to see that the magnitudes were quite comparable in terms of the standard deviation, which is around 0.01, 0.02, 0.03. So we think that there is something happening because there is a significance here, although it's almost zero, but there is a negative impact that we cannot deny, which is quite robust and consistent across all our different empirical strategies. So yes, the effects are small, and we acknowledge that they are not as higher as we should have potentially expected, given the magnitude of the conflict in Angola, but still quite comparable with the few similar studies that look at this topic in other contexts, and also potentially indicating that there's something happening here, although the effect is small due to the second generation nature of the analysis that is being done here.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on that with a related point, but more of a point around estimation. One of the issues that you discussed briefly in Chapter 2 relates to potential survivor bias, and you mentioned that with regards to the parents, but there isn't a focus on potential survivor bias in the analysis among the children, among the second generation. So I wanted to ask how much of an effect you think that may have. For instance, if in conflict-prone regions there is higher infant and child mortality, how could that bias the estimates? And could that potentially contribute to the very small effects on child growth that you see?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for this very thoughtful question. In one of the first analysis that we did, we look at on the 5-year-old mortality. And we did find few negative impacts on the conflict on mortality, but since mortality is more of a stock indicator that is being impacted by various supply side and demand factors, we refrain to present those outcomes into the analysis. But we did recognize that there is a likelihood that the fact that we only focus on children that have survived somehow might actually bias downwards or upwards the point estimate that we have here. We acknowledge that into the discussion, and we are not quite sure how we can reconcile the result that we had obtained on the 5 years mortality of under 5-year-old children, and the fact that we are only focusing on survival children that were alive but that still had this growth retardation as the result of their parent exposure to the conflict, their mothers. So just to summarize, the bottom line is we did run the analysis on the 5 years old mortality, 24 months, 6 months, I guess, no, 1 month, 24 months, and on the 5 years old mortality. And we find only few effects, which were, I think, insignificant, but significant for on the 5 years old mortality. And we also believe that if the fact that we are focusing on survival can actually, we are not sure of the magnitude of the bias, but we acknowledge the fact that it might somehow create some form of a bias in the overall estimate, because but we don't know much about those that die and how they will have fared, or whether they've died as a result of the conflict, since we don't have information on the growth retardation outcome, which is the HI4HZ score or the probability of stunting.
Thank you. I just have one last question, dear candidate. I did appreciate the slide in your summary about some interesting future directions, but maybe if I could pin you down, it was quite interesting seeing the different results between Angola, Burundi, and Cameroon, all related questions. So in this literature, if you were to write the next study, the next chapter on this issue of conflict and child development, what would be the topic you would find the most useful or kind of scientifically most valuable? If you could quickly, give us an idea of your thinking as an expert in this field.
Thank you, esteemed opponent. So I'm quite excited to have recently participated working with the government in Angola on the latest demographic and health survey, which was recently released, the 2022-2024 one. And there we have the children that we study. So the second generation, the children of the second generation. So though it's long, I'm not sure of how well they collected migration history for those children, but I will be quite excited to study how exposure to conflict of the grandparent of those children, whether it's still old, whether there's a third generation impact. But here, by using not the UCPG dataset, but rather the ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location Event dataset, by investigating whether if in a specific district, women are more targeted than men, would that create some form of a bias on the third generations? That's something that I would be quite interested to look at. The gender bias in targeted conflict event, and whether grandchildren of grandparent exposed tend to still exhibit those poor HI4HZ score or growth retardation per se. Thank you.
Thank you.
So the opposition will be continued by Professor Patricia Justino, Professor of Development Economics at the Institute of Development Studies and Deputy Director at UNU Wider. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Dear candidate, I really enjoy reading your thesis, and it was really interesting how you've put together a variety of research questions and some new findings. I wanted to focus on chapter 5, and I have a theoretical question and then a policy question, if I may. So let me start. You look at a cash transfer that was implemented in an area of conflict. And we know that the cash transfers all over the world have had a significant impact on a variety of outcomes, from productive outcomes to human capital, etc. I was intrigued, what sort of literature gap we were trying to address with focusing on cash transfers in a conflict-affected area? Were you expecting a priori a different outcome? How do you think the fact that you're focusing on a conflict-affected area might actually change, or maybe not, the outcomes you were proposed to look at?
Thank you, esteemed opponent. This is a very relevant and interesting question. In general, safety net interventions are challenging to implement, even in stable environment, because the design, the implementation are not that straightforward in general. But in fragile and conflict-affected environment, I think the specificity here is that the infrastructure, so even to, first of all, get accurate information or get the relevant enumerator to go to the field is challenging. Usually we use computer-assisted programming interface to collect the information. So I think here the added value of Chapter 5 is on top of those intervention, on top of the intervention being done in an active, violent environment, is we were trying to see whether people, even if they are living into an environment where there is fear because there's terror, they can still invest. They can still, instead of potentially saving, instead of potentially investing in social sort of outcome like their children education, the health outcome, or purchasing foods, they can actually, invest into something more productive. So that was the investment part in fragile setting that we believe was quite interesting to investigate in far north Cameroon, because as I mentioned, the Boko Haram has been present in the area from 2013, which corresponds to the year where the intervention started, where we started the baseline data collection. So the difference compared to other settings, more stable environment, is that usually people are more prone to invest into productive assets, whereas in fragile environment, the terrorism that it's actually spreading across the area make people less likely to be risk taker somehow, or to want to grow food, because maybe they are afraid that the terrorists will come and destroy their land. But somehow we were quite pleased to see and strive to see that there were a bunch of positive impact on agricultural investment, on food and nutrition security, even when, even when the conflict actually take place and when the magnitude of the conflict was quite higher at the same time that the intervention was implemented or roll out. So that's a little bit the difference that we believe makes the paper quite interesting. So I was quite excited to see what come out of it, instead of looking at savings or investment on education. I was trying to see that the people, even in a kind of terror prone environment, they were still likely to invest in productive assets, and especially in agriculture.
Thank you. That's actually a nice segue to my second question. You obviously have very interesting positive results. And from what I understand, but correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of it is explained also by some of the design features of the intervention. Now, thinking about that in more detail, if I can push you on that a bit, what specific features of the intervention could potentially be replicated in other fragile contexts, or specifically conflict-affected contexts? And what do you think, if you had to give a recommendation, a policy recommendation, say, to the African Union, what design features of the intervention would you recommend to be replicated and potentially scaled up?
Thank you, esteemed opponent. This is another very interesting question. In terms of the design feature, if I can start by the last part of the question, because that's just what is coming out of my mind right now, is that there were some training, although it wasn't more like a cash plus or we didn't really couple the two intervention, but there were training that were done to the different beneficiaries of the intervention on how to grow crops, on how to manage their farms. So that's actually played some role. So there was specific training on corns, for instance, and on cattle breeding, which we did find somehow that were also key mechanism or channel through which the cash transfer did have some positive impact on food security and nutrition outcomes. So I believe combining, somehow combining cash with specific training directed to farmers, especially when the cash transfer is being implemented in rural area, can be beneficial since they can boost agricultural investment more. So that would be something that I will potentially recommend. Also, the fact that we targeted the different households using proxy mean testing was also helpful and confirm somehow we, on top of targeting based on proxy mean testing, we also use community-based targeting to make sure that the people that were receiving the cash transfer were also identified by the community as genuinely poor. So somehow that has kind of lowered down tension and additional conflict that may have arisen between beneficiaries and non-beneficiary because it was based on quantitative facts and empirical facts of a household proxy mean test survey that was carried out before the intervention, but then confirmed by the community. So we believe that those two features, which is associating the community in identifying the core beneficiaries to avoid social tension, friction, and maybe have a negative impact on social cohesion, because people will be fighting with each other and say, why did this specific household receive the cash and not the others? But training also the different beneficiaries has been proving in this specific intervention implemented in a fragile setting efficient or effective to boost productive investment, nutrition, and food security, which generally in fragile setting is an issue. So there are some statistics that shows that the highest food insecure area are actually in FCV settings. So we were quite pleased to see that the training on cows, cattle breeding, and overall livestock have been instrumental in boosting nutrition outcome and food security in this specific design.
Thank you so much.
The opposition will be continued by Dr. Bruno Moritano, Associate Professor of Political Economics at UNU Merit and Maastricht University. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, congratulations for your work first. I had the pleasure to read your thesis and I found it very well written, and of course it investigates a very relevant topic. So my questions, my first questions are mainly about chapter 5. In chapter 5, you are using a unique data set with baseline and follow-up information, and you are able to investigate the impact of cash transfer program in this conflict-affected area, and to basically show that this intervention promoted agriculture productive investments and improve food security. I found, of course, the results very interesting, and the fact that it showed the effectiveness of social protection in this special setting. However, one aspect is still not entirely clear to me, which you briefly mentioned in the conclusion of your thesis, and this is about the potential impact of the program on local prices. So my first question is, do you have any information or data on how the cash transfers may have influenced the local market prices? And if this is the case, what could be the potential consequences on the local market economy, both in the short and the long term?
Thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for this very thoughtful question. As you can see, we added that as avenue for future research, but we did have some ideas on the potential impact of cash transfer on price, which, as you know, has been debated recently in the literature. I want to refer to the Walker-Miguel paper that was released early this year on the potential inflationary impact of cash transfer on prices globally. And in this specific case, although we don't have accurate and fine-grained data on price, though we can have them through national statistical offices that collect price like periodically in Cameroon. We can actually retrieve those information, but we didn't have that in mind at the time we were writing the thesis. So that's why we put it as avenue for future research. But we believe that in this specific case, since the demand of food, which is the primary spending category of household in far North Cameroon, has been quite met with the supply of food that were grown by those households, since we did find, as you see, that the cash transfer has some substantive positive impact on subsistence crops for household. We believe that the inflationary impact might be a little bit lower in this specific case, because although the household, they receive the money, they receive the cash, but even if the money that they will have received should be invested into purchasing more food, the fact that they are growing their own food as the result of the cash, and not just the beneficiary, but also the non-beneficiary, since we did find a spillover effect, so there is no potential loser here. We kind of believe that this impact is minor. This is only our belief, but we still need to empirically test that. And that's the reason why we think that it might be a nice paper to write if we get back in time and get the data on the pricing of the main staple foods in far North Cameroon at the time of the conflict, which is between 2013 and 2016. And this is what we believe we can have those historical price. So yes, so in our case, we don't believe that the cash transfer in this specific area, providing that the household have invested heavily in food production and subsistence crop production, not just the beneficiary, but also non-beneficiaries, we don't clearly see the likelihood that cash will have create or generate inflation.
Thank you very much. I have now another question about chapters 2 and chapter 3. And in this case, it's a more methodological question. So I noticed that in these 2 chapters, the treatment is based on different definition of conflict. In one case is according to the number of deaths in the district, and using also a classification coming from the literature. And in the second case is based on the better related incidents in a given district in the period of study. So my question is, could you clarify why you choose different definitions for the 2 papers, and if you think that this different definition may basically help you to identify different dimensions of conflict?
Thank you very much, esteemed opponent, for this question that we were expecting somehow. So on the paper, the 2 first papers, which is the Angola paper and the Burundi paper, which then use district level variation of conflict exposure, which we know are not completely perfect, as not entirely random. But in the Angola paper, we use the mean as the cutoff based on the empirical visualization that we had on the distribution of debt at the district level, where we did find that using the histogram that there was a clear cutoff at the mean. But we didn't just stop here because we know there's potentially a size effect at the district level. So in the absence of accurate data on the population in the district, we did use the Ajagania and Prata paper, which is one of the first papers that look at the direct impact of the Angola conflict on children's health in 1996, where they have accurate information of conflict zones that were defined as less affected or low affected, based on their knowledge of the area, based on what happened on the ground. So since we know that our measure at the district level, although a little bit more fine-grained than the regional exposure that they use, can potentially suffer from this size bias, we associated their definition with our own to make sure that the district identify based on the mean as a cutoff to classify a district as high or lowly affected, match with their definitions. We combine the two measures, but we also did separate analysis using the two measure of conflict exposure, and we did not find significant differences. So we find almost the same result. So irrelevant of the classification used at the district level, be it by defining the cutoff as the mean, or by combining our district level exposure of conflict using the mean as a cutoff with the Ndola and Ajaganan paper, we did find similar results. So that's somehow convinced us that our results are not driven potentially by the cutoff that we use to classify a specific district as conflict or non-conflict affected. In Burundi, we did the same. So we used the cutoff based on our visualization of the histogram of the number of deaths at the district level to use the median this time around. And as I said, we also use the mean and other measure, and we did not find a significant difference. So it's just because we wanted to stick to the empirical fact that we decided to present in the thesis the cutoff based on either the mean or the median, depending on what the histogram was showing us where the cutoff is actually happening. So we are quite confident that our results are not driven by the cutoff used here. I'm not sure if I responded. Potentially, I forgot one aspect of your question. I'm not sure, but yes.
It's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the opposition will be continued by Dr. Micheline Goodhouse, the PhD Program Director at UNU Merit. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Dear candidate, let me start by congratulating you on the completion of your dissertation. Your research addresses a great, important area, both academically and from a policy perspective. So I enjoyed reading your dissertation very much. I think also by studying multiple countries and contexts, you offer valuable findings related to the long-term and intergenerational effects of violent conflicts and the role of social protection in fragile settings. Now, having said that, I have to come to my question, and I would like to ask you a question that relates to the third chapter on Burundi. Now, chapter 3 provides a detailed analysis of the intergenerational effects of maternal exposure to conflict on early childhood development. However, the role of paternal exposure, although you briefly address it, appears to be less central. You find that fathers exposed to conflict during their primary school age and living in heavily affected districts were less likely to read books with their children, but apart from that, the role of fathers is very limited in the analysis. Now, given that fathers often contribute to household socioeconomic conditions in ways that may influence child development, such as wealth. That was found an important mechanism in your analysis for mothers. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the rationale for focusing predominantly on mothers. So basically, is this emphasis driven by a matter of data availability, or is it a theoretical reasoning, or are there any other motivations? Maybe, yeah, related to this question is to what extent would your data allow for a more symmetric analysis of both parents' exposure? And would you believe that there are opportunities for expanding this line of research in the future? And would you then also expect that effects of maternal and paternal exposure could reinforce each other, or just weaken each other? So what would then be your expectation?
Thank you, esteemed opponent, for this very interesting question. In the Angola paper, we did look at father exposure. So one thing that we would like to mention is that we were not constrained by any data availability issue here, because the same information available for mother were available for father. So in the Angola paper, when we try to, before I respond to your question, just to explain the rationale, when we try to look at the same father exposure to conflict by controlling for migration history, looking at whether they were living in district highly affected, we did not find much. In the Burundi paper, we did the same and we did not find much. And we did believe that potentially the fact that, because also the way the DHS is structured is that information on children are asked to the mothers. So we are also sure that the children belongs to the mother, because the children is the one giving birth, whereas the father is not 100% sure. So there's already this issue of, in terms of, avoiding any measurement bias here. We thought, even though it would be interesting, as you mentioned, to look at the involvement of the father, which is usually the breadwinner in those contexts in Central Africa, be it in Angola, in Burundi, we were quite scared that we are establishing a link here with a potential parent that is not necessarily the genuine parent of the children. So that was the first concern and the first fear that we have of not really moving very fiercely into this. But we did have those results for the
asked.
And we believe it will be an interesting avenue of future research. Unfortunately, we did not mention that in the last slide, but focusing solely on the father will be interesting as a next paper to study.
All right.
Thank you.
Soazic Elise Wang Sonne, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request you and your company await the results of our deliberation and our return. All right. Soazic Elise Wang Sonne, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Cohen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and then Professor Nelissen will say a few words. I invite your supervisor to take the floor. Professor Cohen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prorector. Elise, you've answered a lot of questions in the last 45 minutes. There's one more that you have to answer. And if you get the right answer, it will be the last question you answer as a PhD student. So think carefully. Here it comes. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
Right answer. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Soazic Elise Wang Sonne, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed with the official seal of the university, shown now by the beadle.
Thank you.
Right, Dr. Nelissen, you can take the floor.
Thank you. Dear Dr. Wang Sonne, dear Elise, the first time we met must have been in the late spring of 2014. You were a first-year PhD student finalizing your proposal, traditionally to be defended in June. Nothing uncommon so far. Yet other than your fellow PhD students, you had given birth that same year to your son, Andrew. The PhD program directors therefore offered you an extension of your proposal defense date of at least 3 weeks. Your response was as follows: there's no way I will defend my proposal a day later than the other PhDs in my cohort. I'd rather fail and leave the program than accept an extension. Needless to say that you passed with flying colors. And so your PhD journey began. You were interested in understanding the consequences of violent conflict in Central Africa, a region close to your home and heart. Your first chapter is set in Angola, that, as many African countries, has been through recurring episodes of civil war violence throughout the 90s and early 2000s. When you started your research, a set of new micro-studies came out that generally demonstrated severe negative impacts of violent conflict at the level of the household. You were intrigued, and being trained as a statistician, not in the least by the nifty spatial difference in differences these studies use, but not necessarily surprised by their results. The bigger question to you was whether negative microeconomic impacts persist across generations, even when macro level variables indicate a country's return to the steady state growth path. Such a research question demands a particular setup. The violence had to be sufficiently long enough in the past to see results in the second generation. And violence should arguably be exogenous and geographically dispersed, with some areas more affected than others. Both Angola and Burundi served that purpose. For Angola, you found that exposure to early childhood continues to affect the next generation in terms of anthropometric outcomes. The most interesting part is in the mediation analysis, where you attempt to unravel the channels through which such impacts manifest.
And while biological and possibly epigenetic factors play a role, you find that socioeconomic factors, specifically the lack of mothers' education after secondary school, is a plausible key driver. The paper received quite some traction at the time, and you presented it across the globe at conferences, seminars, and workshops. Motivated by the positive receipt, you then pressed on to work in Burundi, where you used a similar type of identification, but to estimate impacts a little further down the line, learning outcomes. And here you found that, again, results are quite specific to certain age groups exposed to violence and on a specific dimension of cognitive ability, being able to concentrate and work independently. And is relevant, in my view, to current scholarship and societal debates on the relationship between mental health and economic outcomes. You were in great shape, full of ideas, and determined to finalize your PhD in due time. But in the fall of 2016, your beloved son, Andrew, unexpectedly passed away, only 30 months old. You returned to Cameroon for a while, and when back in the Netherlands, you told us you could not live in Maastricht anymore. You obtained a Center for Effective Global Action Fellowship and went to Berkeley. And here I also want to express my sincere gratitude to Ted Miguel, who's here with us today, and Jeremy Weinstein, who was your SIGA mentor, for listening, advising, and being of great support during these very trying times. And while far away, your fellow PhDs from the 2013-14 cohort continue to connect and be there for you. And I also want to acknowledge them for being such good friends. At Berkeley, you were recognized as a strong voice in advocating for more transparency in the social sciences and became a catalyst to the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in Social Sciences by training young researchers in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere on the adoption of rigorous and transparent research methods. After Berkeley, you moved on to the World Bank, first as a UK DFID Young Scholar with the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. And in 2019, you got selected into the prestigious World Bank Young Professional Program. During this period, you also wrote the final 2 chapters of your thesis on the impact of Boko Haram violence and how violence may have affected boys and girls differently, and a quasi-experimental evaluation of an unconditional cash transfer program in northern Cameroon, where violence was not a key independent variable anymore in your analysis, but a highly relevant background setting, and where you show that despite a highly fragile setting, beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries were investing and increasing their incomes as a result of the program. And results are of immediate relevance to current debates about how to best assist people living in volatile and violent settings, issues that are more prevalent now than they were in a long time. During all these years, we loosely kept in touch, not knowing when, but both being silently confident that there would come a time when we would celebrate the completion of your PhD. I would think about you when listening to a song by PJ Harvey called A Perfect Day, Elise, about a young, strong woman just like you. 2 years ago, I heard a familiar knock on my door. Peculiar how we recognize the knocking patterns of our PhDs. And there you were, strong, radiant, and ready to get this done. And you did. As supervisors, we are proud of all our PhDs at the finish line, but I also speak on Robin's behalf when I say that we are especially proud of you. Elise, until yesterday, I did not really know how to start this laudatio. But for a very long time, I knew exactly how it should end, because today is a perfect day, Elise. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Wang Sonne, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the degree you have acquired, and I hereby declare this ceremony closed.